Ministry personnel dishonesty, that's for any embezzlement for someone who is appointed to handle funds. We have had a couple examples of employee dishonesty claims exceeding $1 million. One of those examples was a church and school where the school had an international program. One of the employees had the international students pay him directly, and then he would send the money to the school, or so he told people. He kept, obviously, a lot of money. If it was over $1 million, the school never was able to fully recover that amount. The other example of a claim exceeding $1 million was a large church that had a CPA that everyone trusted with the finances, and he had what the agent described as the keys to the kingdom. This allowed him to create fake audit reports and pretend as though they were getting audits. However, they never actually got audits, and because of that, he was able to steal like $7 million from the church over time. The thing to stress with your customer is that financial controls protect the individuals and they protect the ministry. If you have one of these losses, it's devastating to the church. It's a reputation issue, it's a breach of trust. That's why you need to stress to your customers and your prospects that having internal controls, having multiple counters, making sure the person who handles the money is not the person who keeps the books. You need to make sure they get audits. If they're changing auditors regularly, that's a bad sign. If it had been flagged that changing auditors was a problem and people did more investigation, they would have found the treasurer was embezzling money. Theft of money and securities is theft by someone outside of the organization. So if you get robbed on the way to the bank. Theft by electronic means is the hacking of a wire transfer. I wanted to give you guys a claims example for theft by electronic means. A church we insure had someone hack into their bank account and wire money to their external bank account without the church knowing about it. So you had a hacker getting into the church account, sending money to someone who's not affiliated with the church. This was theft by electronic means. Theft of building materials, it's just a separate sublimit for building materials since they're a higher target for theft. Good thing to note about theft of building materials is that if there's a construction project, you'll want to quote higher limits for this coverage. Once the building materials are attached to the building, they become part of the building or builder's risk coverage. So for example, if you had a bunch of AC units on site, they're building materials until the point where they get attached to the building, at which point they're part of the builder's risk or they're a part of the building. A new coverage available in 2018 is theft by coercion. This covers a few things, one of which is ransomware. I had this happen to one of my customers. It wasn't covered since it wasn't available at the time. They had a preschool employee click a link in a spam email which allowed cyber hackers to take control of their system and hold it ransom for Bitcoin. My customer elected to instead recreate all their servers. This costed probably about $10,000 to $20,000. We had no way of covering that. Theft by coercion is now a way to cover that. Theft by coercion also covers cyber fraud, including phishing emails. I had this also happen to one of my customers. An email came from the senior pastor's email address requesting an amount of money similar to what had been requested in a meeting. However, this wasn't actually coming from the senior pastor. This was coming from an external party, and when the treasurer wired money to this external party, it was never to be seen again. So this is also covered in theft by coercion. That type of thing used to not be covered because it was considered voluntary parting. Voluntary parting is not covered. If you get scammed by a traveling salesman, it's not covered by your insurance policy because you voluntarily gave that money up. However, theft by coercion now covers these phishing emails. Interior water damage. This is for if there's no damage to the structure of the building. Most companies will not cover this because they say it's a maintenance or an installation issue. An example of a claim I had was about a $10 million church building. They hired the biggest contractor in the area to replace the flat roof. There was a storm coming up and they had part of the roof exposed. The church office manager went to the contractor and said, "Hey, are you prepared for this storm?" Contractor said, yeah, we're good. They put up their temporary covering, storm blew off that temporary covering and did $100,000 in water damage. The contractor's insurance then denied the claim. Brotherhood, with his interior water damage, paid for the damage to the inside and then went back after the contractor's insurance. This will also cover if hurricane comes up, blows up the shingles, but doesn't blow them off, so there's no damage to the roof after the storm, but water gets into the inside. We'll pay for the damage on the inside, but we won't pay to fix the leaky roof. That's what interior water damage does. Sewer and drain backup, that's sewage backing up into the building, or if you had interior drain backs up and water comes in and damages the inside, that's sewer and drain backup. A lot of companies, especially your standard ISO companies, will put a sub-limit on this. So property limits means these limits up here. Moving on, we've got surface water or flood coverage. That's water builds up on the ground, gets in that way. Equipment breakdown, this is for anything sudden and accidental that happens to your mechanical systems. So it's covering your AC units, it's covering your refrigerator, it's covering your soundboard, it's covering your alarm system, it's covering your phone system, and what it's covering for is power surge, mechanical breakdown, motor burnout, centrifugal force. Now remember, it's an insurance policy, it's not a maintenance policy, so if it's an old unit that just goes bad, that's not sudden and accidental. However, I had this happen where 4-year-old building, one of the AC units has mechanical breakdown, it goes bad. That puts more strain on the other 4 units, and then individually all 4 units went out. That mechanical breakdown, since that was sudden and accidental, is covered here by equipment breakdown. And this will also cover boiler cracking and boiler inspections. The key terms, anything sudden and accidental that's happening to your mechanical systems or anything you plug in the wall. The most common claim being power surge. Next, we're on to loss of earnings, expense, and extra expense. I always explain this as 2 sides to a coin. You've got the loss of earnings, which says you had a covered loss. Let's say the roof collapsed over the daycare, and the daycare has to close down for 2 months. So there's 2 months of tuitions they were going to collect. They're no longer collecting. Well, we're paying the loss of earnings, lost tuition, so that they can keep paying their staff and they can keep paying their expenses and they can get up and going whenever possible. The other side to the coin then is extra expense. Extra expense says we'll pay for any extra expenses for you to get back up and going. So in other words, you're paying the extra expenses so that you pay a lower loss of earnings claims. It's better for the customer anyways, especially for a church. We will pay the extra expenses for you to keep holding church services. Whether that means you bring in a bubble tent, if you rent the local movie theater, they'll pay for the extra expenses for you to keep going. One thing to note with extra expense and earnings expense is you need a limit in both buckets for both limits to be lumped into one. So for example, if you had $10,000 in extra expense coverage and $10,000 in earnings and expense coverage, those two could be lumped in together and be used for either. You only get a total of $20,000, but it could be used for extra expense or earnings and expense. So it's important to have a number in both buckets so that it can be applied to both, because if you had $0 in extra expense and $20,000 in earnings and expense, you would only have $20,000 in coverage for earnings and expense. Whereas if you had $10,000 in both fields, you would get $20,000 to apply to either coverage. This is also a good time for you to talk about disaster recovery programs. If you've got more interested in that, I'm hoping to do videos on that in the future. Loss of donations. This is for any dip in donations while they were removed from their building. So while they're forced to meet in the fire hall or movie theater, if their attendance goes down and giving goes down and they're able to show there's a noticeable dip in giving, this loss of donations will pay for the dip in giving while they had to relocate. The relocation must be from a covered loss. Additionally, there's an 8-day waiting period for loss of donations coverage. So if you had a fire, take down the building, you're relocating for a year. Those first 8 days, that's not covered. It's your time deductible. You've got to have that loss kicking you out of place for more than 8 days. It can't just be one Sunday. If you had a big snowstorm, there's no damage to the building, but the roads are backed up so that nobody can make it to church, they cancel church service. This is not covered by loss of donations because it wasn't a loss from a covered peril.